Western churches left Enoch outside the Bible, but Grok found its fingerprints inside the text they kept. The accepted story sounds clean. For most Protestant, Catholic, and Eastern Orthodox Christians, the Book of Enoch is non-canonical. It sits outside the Old Testament, outside the pulpit cycle, outside the ordinary Bible on the table. Then, the Watchers passages were placed beside Genesis 6, Jude 14 and 15, and the Judgment Oracle in 1 Enoch 1:9. Grok was asked to compare the language, not preach a doctrine. One overlap would not go away. Was Enoch discarded fantasy, preserved ancient interpretation, or a missing witness to early Christian judgment theology? To see why the answer matters, the record has to begin with the book Western readers were trained not to open. Picture a dark screen with 3 windows open. In the first window sits the prompt to Grok. It asks for a comparison between the Watchers, the sons of God in Genesis, the Nephilim, the Lord coming with holy ones, and the language of judgment. No creed is being voted on. No church council is being replaced by a machine. The test is narrower. Find the pattern. In the second window are manuscript images, long columns of Ge'ez text, dark ink against aged parchment. The lines belong to the Ethiopian survival of Enoch, where the book did not vanish into a footnote. It remained scripture within the Ethiopian Orthodox Tewahedo tradition, read inside a living church, guarded in a language most Western Christians never encounter. That detail matters. In the third window are fragments from Qumran, torn pieces, broken lines, ancient Aramaic remains from the Dead Sea Scrolls. They do not give the modern reader a whole Western Bible with Enoch put back into place. They do something more exact. They show that Enochic material was present in Jewish religious life before Christianity became a separate movement. Then there is the fourth object on the table, a Western Bible. Open the front pages, find Genesis, find Daniel, find Matthew, find Jude near the back, brief enough to miss if a hand turns too quickly. But between Malachi and Matthew, or inside the Old Testament table, Enoch is absent. Most Western Christians can attend church for decades and never hear a full sermon on the Watchers, Azazel, or the heavenly judgment scenes that shaped parts of ancient Jewish imagination. The absence feels ordinary because it was inherited. But 1 Enoch is not a simple modern book written in one piece. It is a collection of ancient writings, with different parts and layers. For this investigation, the central chamber is the Book of the Watchers, the early Enochic material that tells of heavenly beings descending, crossing a forbidden boundary, and corrupting the earth before judgment comes.
The subject is sacred to many readers. It has to be handled with care. The question is not whether Western churches are foolish. The question cuts closer. How did a book excluded from most Western canons remain close enough to biblical language that the New Testament still appears to carry its echo? The missing page is not enough by itself. The first pressure point is how close Enoch stands to texts Western churches still read. The mainstream Western explanation is not weak. It deserves a fair hearing. Enoch is usually classed as pseudepigraphal. That means the work is attributed to an ancient figure, Enoch from Genesis, while the writings themselves were composed and collected much later than the man described in the primeval story. Genesis says Enoch walked with God, and then he was not, because God took him. The later Enochic books expand that small biblical doorway into visions, angels, heavenly tablets, judgment scenes, and warnings against corrupted knowledge. Western churches did not preserve Enoch in the Hebrew Bible canon they received. Major Catholic, Protestant, and Eastern Orthodox traditions did not place one Enoch inside their Old Testament in the way the Ethiopian Orthodox Tewahedo Church did. In those Western settings, Enoch became useful background, strange ancient literature, or a disputed writing, but not scripture. That position is not mockery, it is canon history. The clean explanation would be easier if the book had left no trace. But the record does not close there. Second Temple Jewish communities knew Enochic traditions. The Qumran fragments prove that copies of Enochic material circulated in an ancient Jewish environment. Early Christians also knew the book or the tradition around it. Some valued it, some resisted it, some let it fade from ordinary reading. Then Jude steps forward. Jude is small, one page in many Bibles, easy to pass over. But inside that short letter comes a line about the Lord coming with holy ones to execute judgment. The wording stands very close to 1 Enoch 1:9, where the Holy One comes with his holy ones and judgment falls upon the ungodly. Hold that detail. Western churches may exclude Enoch from the Old Testament, but they still read Jude as canonical. That means a Western reader can hold an approved New Testament text in hand and encounter a judgment line that appears to quote or closely echo Enochic tradition. The measurement matters here, and the measurement is textual. This is not a vague similarity about angels or the flood. It is a short judgment formula with the same movement. The Lord comes. Holy ones accompany him. Judgment is executed. The ungodly are exposed. The old earth is placed under divine courtroom language. A church can say Enoch is not canonical and still admit Jude uses language connected to Enoch. Those statements can stand together. But they create pressure.
They force a distinction many ordinary believers were never taught to make. Not canonical does not mean irrelevant. A text can be outside a church's canon and still preserve ideas, phrases, images, and arguments that shape the world of biblical writers. A book can be rejected as scripture by one tradition and still matter historically for understanding the vocabulary of another text. A writing can be absent from the table of contents and still stand behind a sentence that believers read every year. That is where Grok's test becomes useful. The AI is not asked to crown Enoch. It is not asked to overrule bishops, rabbis, councils, or confessions. It is asked to do something narrower and colder. Place the passages together. Compare their structures. Track repeated agents, sins, consequences, and judgment terms. That wording is not casual, so the AI test begins with the words, Western canon cannot quite separate from Enoch. The prompt begins with Genesis 5. There is Enoch, the seventh from Adam in the line of Seth, described with rare brevity. He walks with God. Then he is taken. The text gives no death scene, no grave, no final words. It leaves behind a holy absence, and later tradition rushes toward that silence. Then the prompt moves to Genesis 6. The sons of God see the daughters of men. They take wives. The Nephilim appear. The earth becomes corrupt and filled with violence. The flood story follows. Genesis does not stop to name the rebel beings. It does not give their teaching list. It does not describe a mountain descent or heavenly trial in detail. It gives a doorway. Then, first Enoch opens that doorway into a corridor. The Watchers descend to Mount Hermon. Their leaders are named. Their rebellion is organized. Azazel teaches weapon-making, ornaments, cosmetics, and arts that the story treats as corrupting. Other Watchers teach enchantments, astrology, signs, and hidden knowledge. The giants consume. Bloodshed spreads. The earth cries out. Heaven responds with judgment. On another part of the screen, Daniel-like imagery appears. Thrones, courts, books, heavenly beings. A moral universe where earthly violence is answered by a tribunal above human power. The prompt does not flatten all apocalyptic writings into one thing. It asks whether the images share a family resemblance. Then Jude is placed beside the cluster. Jude speaks of angels who did not keep their proper domain. It speaks of judgment. It names Enoch, seventh from Adam, and gives a prophecy about the Lord coming with holy ones. That is not background noise. It is a canonical author reaching into an older stream of interpretation. The AI's task is limited. That limit gives the answer weight. Grok cannot settle canon. It cannot measure inspiration. It cannot decide whether a church should alter its Bible. It cannot hear liturgy across centuries or replace the authority claims of an ancient communion. A machine can compare language, structure, and motifs at scale. It can detect whether a passage behaves like an isolated curiosity or part of a larger theological pattern. So the prompt asks for a matrix. Across the rows are Genesis 5, Genesis 6, the Book of the Watchers, Jude, and related judgment language. Across the columns are repeated agents and repeated acts, heavenly beings, boundary crossing, forbidden union, forbidden teaching, giants, bloodshed, corruption of creation, imprisonment, flood, courtroom judgment, final reckoning. The screen fills with connections. The pattern does not treat Enoch as a simple monster story. It does not treat the watchers as decorative angels placed around the edges of Scripture. It reads the text as a moral explanation for how rebellion in heaven becomes violence on earth. That is the part that changes the case. In the Book of the Watchers, sin is not only a human mistake rising from the ground, it also descends.
It arrives as knowledge taken across a boundary and placed in hands not prepared to bear it. The text imagines evil as contamination from above and violence spreading below. That pattern sits close to Genesis 6. It sits close to Jude. It sits near later Christian imagination about angels, judgment, and the unseen world. Once the passages are compared side by side, one pattern rises above the rest. Grok's central reading is severe. The Book of the Watchers is not mainly about curiosity over angels. Its center is judgment. The Watcher's story explains why evil expanded before the flood by showing forbidden knowledge entering human society through a rebellion from heaven. The proof object is not only the giants. That matters because giants draw the eye. Nephilim imagery is dramatic. It gives artists huge bodies, broken landscapes, and strange bones in the imagination. But the text's deeper concern is transmission.
What did the Watchers give humanity that humanity was not meant to receive in that way? Azazel becomes the visible mark. In 1st Enoch, Azazel teaches the making of swords, knives, shields, and breastplates. The scene is not a neutral technology lesson. Weapons enter the story as instruments of violence. The earth does not become more civilized, it becomes wounded. Then come adornments and cosmetics. The language can sound strange to modern ears, but inside the ancient moral frame it belongs to seduction, corruption, and the distortion of human desire. Other watchers teach enchantments, root cuttings, astrology, signs, and hidden arts. The text gathers these teachings like evidence on a table. The knowledge is the wound. Genesis 6 is much shorter. It says the earth was corrupt before God and filled with violence. It does not name Azazel. It does not list the arts. It does not tell the reader which watcher taught what. It gives the flood generation as a moral collapse, then moves toward judgment. Enoch slows the camera down. It places names beside the collapse. It gives motives. It gives a chain of custody for forbidden knowledge. It shows the earth crying out under bloodshed. It portrays heaven as responding not with irritation, but with judicial action. That is why Grok's matrix becomes uncomfortable for Western readers. A familiar sermon can pass quickly over Genesis 6 because the passage is difficult. Who are the sons of God? What are the Nephilim? Why does the story move so quickly into the flood? Many teachers make a cautious comment, then proceed to Noah. That caution is understandable. The passage is brief, debated, and easy to sensationalize. Enoch refuses to move quickly. It names the beings. It gives Mount Hermon as the descent point. It frames the act as a cosmic trespass. It connects heavenly rebellion with earthly bloodshed. It gives the flood a wider courtroom setting.
The AI does not need to believe the story to see the structure. That is the force of pattern detection. Whether a reader treats 1st Enoch as scripture, ancient interpretation, or apocalyptic literature, the text is doing serious theological work. It is asking why the world before the flood became so violent. It is asking what happens when hidden knowledge is severed from obedience. It is asking whether intelligence without holiness becomes a weapon. The issue is not whether every detail must be imported back into Genesis. Grok does not have to say, Genesis requires Enoch. A careful reader does not have to pretend the shorter biblical passage secretly contains every later expansion. The sharper claim is smaller and harder to avoid. Enoch gives specific form to a problem Genesis names briefly. Jude then appears to draw on that Enochic world when he warns about judgment. The Western canon leaves Enoch outside, but one of its own New Testament letters carries Enochic judgment language inside. The named watchers are the pressure point. Their names and teachings turn an obscure ancient passage into a moral map. The map says, corruption did not spread by accident.
It spread through rebellion, instruction, imitation, and violence. It spread because knowledge crossed a forbidden line and became power without righteousness. But Grok's first answer does not prove Enoch belongs in every Bible. It creates a harder question about why the book was left outside. There is a catch. Exclusion from most Western canons does not automatically mean a deliberate cover-up. That claim is too easy and too loud. Canon history is slower than that. It moves through languages, worship practices, inherited communities, theological disputes, manuscript survival, and the authority each tradition recognizes. A book can disappear from ordinary use without a single locked room.
Enoch survived strongly in Ethiopia. That survival matters. The Ethiopian Orthodox Tewahedo tradition did not treat the book as a lost curiosity. It preserved First Enoch in Ge'ez, copied it, read it, and held it within a broader biblical collection than most Western Christians know. In the Greek and Latin West, the story is different. Enoch was known, then increasingly marginal. Some early Christian writers valued it. Tertullian defended its usefulness and treated it with seriousness. Other Christian authorities were more suspicious, less interested, or unwilling to receive it as scripture. Over time, the book faded from the Bible most Western believers inherited. The result is visible on a table. On one side sits a Western Old Testament with no Enoch. On another side sits Ethiopian scripture with Enoch present. Between them sit Qumran fragments, showing that Enochic material was not a medieval invention or a late fantasy detached from ancient Jewish thought. It was already circulating in a world that formed the background of the New Testament. That is the real, avoided answer Grok identifies. Not that Western churches all gathered to hide the book. The record does not require that. The more serious answer is that Western churches inherited a canon that left out a text early Christians and ancient Jewish communities still found meaningful. That is harder to dismiss. A cover-up can be mocked or defended against. A transmission problem cannot be brushed away so easily. It sits in manuscript history. It sits in language loss. It sits in the difference between what a church receives as scripture and what a biblical author may have known, quoted, or echoed. The scan cannot prove motive, but it can prove the overlap exists. That boundary is important. Grok cannot say why every Western community made every canonical decision. It cannot reduce centuries of reception to one villain. It cannot pretend Ethiopia's canon automatically settles Protestant, Catholic, or Eastern Orthodox canon questions. But it can show a pressure line. If Jude uses Enochic judgment language, and if Qumran preserved Enochic fragments, and if Ethiopian Christianity kept the book as scripture, then the Western absence of Enoch is not a reason to treat it as irrelevant. The absence becomes part of the evidence. It shows a narrowing of ordinary reading. That narrowing has consequences. When Enoch is absent, Genesis 6 becomes stranger and smaller. The sons of God appear, the Nephilim appear, violence fills the earth, and many readers are left with a few rushed theories. When Enoch is present as ancient context, the same passage sits inside a larger interpretive world. It is not made simple, but it becomes more historically visible. The question changes. It is no longer, why should anyone care about a non-canonical book? The question becomes, what did Western readers lose when a major ancient witness to their own New Testament's judgment language fell out of ordinary view? That is where the file turns. The record does not stop at canon tables. The next layer is what Enoch does to judgment itself. Jude 6 is the next exhibit. It speaks of angels who did not keep their proper domain, but left their own dwelling. They are kept in eternal chains under darkness for judgment. The wording is brief, but the atmosphere is thick. Rebellion, boundary crossing, confinement, future judgment. That sounds close to the Watcher's world. The Book of the Watchers tells of heavenly beings who abandon their appointed place, descend, corrupt the earth, and face confinement until the day of judgment. The details are not identical in every line, and no careful reader should pretend all ancient texts say the same thing. But the resemblance is strong enough to demand attention. Then 2 Peter enters the chain.
2 Peter 2:4 speaks of angels who sinned and were cast into gloomy darkness, held for judgment. Again, the New Testament wording is shorter than Enoch. Again, the image carries the same weight: angelic rebellion, imprisonment, darkness, and future judgment. Influence is not canon. That sentence has to stay on the table. A biblical writer can use a known tradition without making every line of that tradition scripture. Paul can quote a poet without canonizing the poet. Jude can use a prophecy associated with Enoch without settling every later debate about the whole Enochic collection. But influence is still evidence. It means the world behind the New Testament was larger than the trimmed table of contents most modern readers inherit. It means early Christian warnings about judgment did not arise in a vacuum. They were spoken into a Jewish apocalyptic environment filled with courts of heaven, rebel angels, books opened, holy ones coming, and divine sentences carried out. Genesis 6 is the old doorway. Jude and 2 Peter are the later echoes. The Book of the Watchers is the long corridor between them. Grok's side-by-side chain does not need drama to be disturbing. Put the passages together, and the shared elements become visible. The sons of God cross a boundary in Genesis. The Watchers descend and corrupt in Enoch. Jude speaks of angels who abandon their domain. 2 Peter speaks of sinning angels held in darkness. Jude also cites Enoch's judgment formula about the Lord coming with holy ones. The chain is not imaginary. It is textual, thematic, and historical. The problem is that most Western Christians are trained to read only the first and last pieces. Genesis is read, Jude is read, Enoch is missing from the middle. The bridge is removed, then readers are told not to wonder why the two cliffs face each other. The measurement matters. There is also the Son of Man and heavenly court language in later Enochic sections. This material has to be handled carefully. Dating matters. Layers matter. Scholars debate which parts developed when and how they relate to Daniel and later Christian language. Grok cannot flatten those questions into a slogan. Still, the atmosphere is hard to miss. Enochic literature preserves a world where heavenly figures, thrones, books, judgment, and righteous vindication are central. That world helps explain why New Testament judgment language can sound so charged. When Jesus speaks of the Son of Man, when Jude warns about the ungodly, when apocalyptic scenes show courts and books, readers are hearing echoes from a wider Jewish imagination, not a blank background. The early church knew this wider world. Tertullian valued Enoch and argued for its importance, especially because of its connection to Jude. Others were cautious. Some rejected it. Some left it outside their scriptural inheritance. The conversation did not move in one clean line. It moved through argument, reception, suspicion, and loss. That uneven history is part of the proof chain. If Enoch were merely a fringe curiosity with no early weight, Jude's use would be easier to dismiss as an oddity. If Enoch had no ancient Jewish witness, Qumran would be silent. If no Christian writer cared, Tertullian's defense would not exist. If the book had vanished everywhere, Ethiopia would not have preserved it as scripture. But the pieces remain. A canonical letter names Enoch. Ancient fragments survive in the desert. An African Christian tradition keeps the book in its Bible. Early Christian writers knew the debate. Later Western readers inherit the absence and often mistake that absence for irrelevance. That is how records become sealed without a lock. Not always by force, sometimes by distance, sometimes by language, sometimes by the slow habit of reading only what the inherited table of contents allows. The result is a gap between what early Christian authors could assume and what many later Christians are taught to recognize. Grok's answer is not a sermon. It is a map of pressure points. Genesis 6 gives the brief crisis. Enoch gives names, descent, forbidden teaching, and courtroom detail. Jude gives a canonical echo and a direct Enochic prophecy. 2 Peter gives a related judgment atmosphere. Ethiopian scripture keeps the witness visible. Western canons largely remove it from ordinary biblical reading. The data can show influence and pressure. It cannot command a church to change its Bible. That boundary makes the final implication stronger, not weaker. If Grok had simply declared, "Enoch belongs in every Bible," the answer would be easy to challenge. A machine cannot settle sacred authority by pattern matching. It cannot replace the history of canon. It cannot measure inspiration. It cannot hear the worship life of communities across centuries.
But the answer it does give is harder to wave away. Enoch may preserve an ancient interpretive world behind parts of the New Testament that many Western Christians no longer possess. That is the answer Western churches avoid, because it does not require accusing them of fraud. It requires admitting the ordinary reading frame may be incomplete. The proof object remains Jude. Jude's words still sit in the canon. The Lord comes with holy ones. Judgment falls on the ungodly. The line points back toward 1 Enoch 1:9 strongly enough that even cautious readers have to account for it. Western churches can keep Enoch outside their Old Testament, but they cannot erase the Enochic trace from Jude without changing Jude. The first overlap has not moved. Only the size of the question around it has changed. If Enoch is treated as fantasy, Jude becomes harder to explain. If Enoch is treated as scripture for every church without argument, canon history becomes too simple.
If Enoch is treated as an ancient witness, the pieces fit with more discipline. The book may not command every Western pulpit, but it can illuminate why early Christians spoke about angels, rebellion, judgment, and hidden knowledge in the way they did. That illumination has consequences. Genesis 6 is no longer a strange paragraph to hurry past. It becomes a passage surrounded by ancient interpretation. Jude is no longer only a short warning letter with one unusual citation. It becomes a window into a judgment tradition older than the church's later boundaries. The Watchers are no longer entertainment about angels. They become a warning about knowledge severed from obedience. That warning is not small. The Book of the Watchers imagines intelligence as dangerous when it crosses a holy boundary. Weapons without righteousness become bloodshed. Signs without humility become manipulation. Hidden arts without obedience become corruption. The story is ancient, but the moral pressure still lands in a world that trusts every new tool before asking what kind of people will use it. That may be why Enoch still feels alive. It gives a name to the fear that knowledge can arrive as a gift and become a wound. It gives form to the idea that judgment is not random anger, but the answer of heaven to corrupted creation. It gives Jude's short warning a wider sky. The AI cannot tell a believer what to revere. It can only place the pages together and show where the language touches. And where the language touches, the record is difficult to close. So where do you land? Was Enoch rightly excluded from the Western canon because the churches received a different boundary for Scripture? Was it preserved as a valuable ancient witness that helps explain Genesis, Jude, and early Christian judgment language? Or is it a missing chapter many churches avoid because it complicates the clean version of the story?
The answer depends on what kind of authority you are weighing. Canon is one question. Influence is another. Historical memory is another. The Book of Enoch sits at the intersection of all three, which is why it keeps returning after centuries of absence from most Western Bibles. The Watchers force a harder question than most angel stories allow. If forbidden knowledge corrupts the earth, then the danger is not knowledge alone. The danger is knowledge torn away from holiness, humility, and judgment. If Jude carries Enochic language, then Western readers have to ask why a non-canonical book is close enough to a canonical warning to leave fingerprints on the page. And if the Ethiopian Bible preserved what the West mostly set aside, then the Christian record is wider than many believers were taught to imagine. That does not require contempt for Western churches. It requires honesty about the evidence. A careful believer can respect canon boundaries and still ask what ancient witnesses reveal. An independent truth seeker can follow the manuscripts without turning every gap into an accusation. The record is open now. The question is whether Enoch is a discarded book, a preserved witness, or a missing lens for reading judgment texts that never stopped carrying its shadow. Leave your verdict on the Watchers, Jude's quotation, and the Ethiopian preservation of Enoch. Should influence change how Christians read judgment, or should canon alone decide what belongs in the center? Subscribe for the next record, the next manuscript, the next scan, and the next hidden file that forces the official explanation to answer one more question.